The sun had not yet cleared the peaks to the east when the first bullet struck the adobe wall. It was late in the year 1884, somewhere between late October and early December. The historical record would later disagree on the precise calendar date, in a settlement called Middle San Francisco Plaza in what was still New Mexico territory. Not yet a state, 110 miles west of Socorro as a man on horseback might travel. Inside a structure no larger than 12 feet by 14 feet, a jacal built from mesquite sticks, chinked with dried mud and a few rough-cut planks, a 19-year-old man named Elfego Baca pressed himself against the dirt floor and listened to the sound of men gathering outside. The floor lay 18 inches below ground level, dug out to provide insulation against the high desert cold, and that sunken earth would matter in the hours to come. Baca had perhaps 2 revolvers. Accounts vary, maybe a rifle. Certainly ammunition he had carried in on his person and whatever had been stored in this small dwelling that belonged to a local man named Geronimo Armijo. Outside, the number of armed men was growing. Some came from the slaughter ranch. The outfit that employed the cowboy Baca had arrested the previous day for shooting up Bill Milligan's saloon and terrorizing Hispanic townspeople. Others rode in from neighboring spreads, drawn by word that had traveled fast across the San Francisco River Valley. Word that a Mexican deputy, or maybe a self-appointed one depending on who told the story, had killed a Texas cowboy and now refused to surrender to proper authority, or to any authority the Cowboys recognized as proper. The number would grow through the day and into the night. Contemporary witnesses counted differently. Some said 40 men, some said 80. Baca himself would later claim there were 80 or more. What cannot be disputed is that one man faced a force that outnumbered him by a factor of at least 40 to 1, probably more, and that the siege that followed would last approximately 33 hours, becoming the longest sustained civilian gunfight in the documented history of the American West. The Tombstone gunfight near the OK Corral, which would be seared into national memory and retold in countless films and books, involved 9 men total and lasted perhaps 90 seconds. Here in this obscure settlement in the mountains of western New Mexico territory, a confrontation orders of magnitude larger in scale and duration was unfolding, and it would be all but forgotten by the broader American public for 70 years until Walt Disney Studios turned it into a television series in 1958. But on this morning in late 1884, there was no legend yet, no television, no retrospective understanding of what was about to occur. There was only a young man, 5 foot 7 inches tall according to his own accounting, born on February the 10th, 1865 in Socorro to Francisco and Juana Maria Baca, who had spent part of his childhood in Topeka, Kansas after his family migrated north in the 1860s, who had returned to New Mexico territory after his mother's death in 1880, and who now found himself in the kind of situation that could plausibly end with his body being dragged through the street or strung up from whatever timber could support the weight. The West in 1884 was not the West of orderly courtrooms and reliable telegraph lines to territorial governors. It was a place where violence often settled disputes before law could arrive, if law arrived at all, and where a Hispanic man who had just killed a Texas cowboy could expect no mercy from the dead man's companions. This is the story of what happened in those 33 hours. It is a story that challenges every assumption about how such confrontations typically ended. It is about ethnicity and power in the territories, about the cattle industry's transformation of the landscape, about the mechanics of firearms and adobe construction, about the very specific topography of one small river valley, and about the decisions made by one teenager that would define the rest of his 80-year life. The myths would come later. What follows is what the records actually support. The trouble had started, as these things often did, in a saloon. The San Francisco River Valley in 1884 was a relatively recent site of permanent Hispanic settlement. Spanish-speaking families had established 3 small plazas along the river in the 1860s and 1870s. They called them Upper, Middle, and Lower, San Francisco Plaza, strung along perhaps 10 miles of river valley in the mountainous country of what would eventually become Catron County, carved out of Socorro County decades later. The Upper Plaza would be renamed Reserve when the U.S. Forest Service established headquarters there. The middle and lower plazas would largely fade from the map. In 1884, they were collectively known by the shorthand Frisco, and they represented a foothold of settlement in country that was only recently pacified following the Apache campaigns of the late 1870s. Socorro County in 1884 was enormous, sprawling across more than 6,000 square miles of mountain and high desert. The county seat at Socorro, established centuries before by Spanish colonists and named for the help they received from Pueblo people at that location, sat 74 miles south of present-day Albuquerque along the Rio Grande. From Socorro west to the San Francisco River Valley was a long day's hard ride or 2 days at a more sustainable pace. The population was sparse and predominantly Hispanic, descendants of Spanish colonial families who had worked the land for generations alongside newer arrivals. The Anglo population was growing, driven primarily by the cattle industry. Texas ranchers were pushing west in the 1880s. Multiple severe droughts in West Texas in the mid-1880s had forced cattlemen to seek new range. New Mexico Territory offered vast tracts of unfenced public land and relatively mild winters that allowed cattle to graze year-round without the expense of sheltering or heavy feeding. The territory's integration into national rail networks accelerated after the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway reached New Mexico in the 1880s. Magdalena, 26 miles west of Socorro, would become a major railhead. From Magdalena, cattle trails stretched westward another 125 miles, a route eventually formalized as the Magdalena Livestock Driveway, known colloquially as the Beefsteak Trail. It was the last major cattle trail in regular use in the continental United States, operating until 1971. The economics were straightforward. A rancher could claim public rangeland simply by using it, running cattle across thousands of acres of federal domain without purchasing the land, paying only for whatever small parcels he might need for headquarters and essential improvements. Labor was cheap. Cowboys earned $15 to $25 per month plus keep. The railroad provided market access to Kansas City and Chicago stockyards. The primary costs were cattle purchase or breeding stock, a crew, horses, and whatever minimal infrastructure you built. Margins could be substantial if you ran enough cattle over enough range and if your animals survived to market weight. But the business attracted a certain type of operator and employed a certain type of man. These were not, generally, men accustomed to deference or restraint. John Bunyan Slaughter was one such operator. Born December 15, 1848 in Sabine County, Texas, he came from a ranching family. His father, George Webb Slaughter, had fought in the Texas Revolution and later became a Baptist preacher and cattle rancher. John Bunyan and his brothers, including Christopher Columbus Slaughter, who would become legendary in his own right, had driven cattle up the Chisholm Trail to Kansas markets starting in 1866. By the 1880s, John Bunyan Slaughter was an established cattleman. In 1883, he sold his operation in Crosby County, Texas, and moved cattle to rangeland he claimed in Socorro County, New Mexico Territory. His outfit employed cowboys, mostly Texans, mostly young men whose primary qualification was the ability to stay on a horse and handle livestock in rough country. Discipline among such crews varied wildly, depending on the foreman and the owner's attention. Violence toward Hispanic residents, when it occurred, often went unpunished by local authorities who either sympathized with the Texans or feared confronting them. Into this context rode Elfego Baca in late October or early December of 1884. The exact circumstances of his arrival are contested. One account states that Pedro Saracino, who held some law enforcement position in the Frisco area and operated a saloon, traveled to Socorro and complained to Baca that Hispanic residents were being terrorized by Texas cowboys. Saracino, in this telling, offered Baca the job of deputy, possibly as a challenge to the young man's bravado. Baca, age 19, accepted and rode the 100-plus miles to Frisco. Another version suggests Baca was already deputized and was campaigning in the area on behalf of the Socorro County Sheriff. A third account claims Baca pinned on a badge he made himself, essentially self-appointing. What is consistent across accounts is that Baca arrived with a badge of some kind, a Colt .45 revolver with black resin grips, and the conviction that someone needed to impose order on the Texas Cowboys, who, in his view, and the view of many Hispanic residents, acted as if local law did not apply to them. On October 29, 1884, or December 1st, depending on the source consulted, a cowboy named Charlie McCarty entered a saloon, likely Bill Milligan's establishment in what was then called Milligan's Plaza, the upper settlement. McCarty had been drinking. He began shooting, firing his pistol inside the building and into the street. In some accounts, he forced Hispanic patrons to dance at gunpoint, shooting at their feet. In one telling, he shot Baca's hat off. Saloon owner Milligan, or someone else, sought out Baca. The young deputy, with several local Hispanic men assisting, confronted McCarty and disarmed him. Baca arrested McCarty and took him to an adobe structure on the plaza, holding him there pending a decision about where to try him. This was the spark. Charlie McCarty was no ordinary drifter. He rode for the John Bunyan Slaughter Ranch. To arrest him was to challenge the entire outfit, and by extension the informal hierarchy that placed Texas cowboys above Hispanic townspeople in the social order of the territory. Word spread quickly. The next morning, a group of Slaughter Ranch cowboys, estimates range from 12 to 20 men, rode into the plaza. The foreman of the Slaughter Ranch, according to multiple accounts, was among them. So was a man named Young Parham, identified as second in command at the Slaughter outfit, and a rancher named Bert Hearn, who came from a spread called Spur Lake Ranch. They demanded McCarty's release. A local justice of the peace, possibly named Ted White, quickly convened and fined McCarty $5 for disturbing the peace, ordering his release. But the cowboys wanted more. They wanted Baca. The justice, seeking to defuse the situation or perhaps yielding to pressure from the Texans, ordered Baca to submit to questioning regarding the death of one of the Slaughter men. Accounts differ on precisely when this death occurred. Some sources say that during the initial confrontation when Baca disarmed McCarty, Baca fired at the gathering cowboys, and his bullet struck the horse carrying the Slaughter foreman. The horse collapsed, crushing and killing its rider. Other versions place this death during a subsequent confrontation. What is clear is that by this point, a man was dead, and Baca was blamed. When Bert Hearn attempted to force Baca out of the adobe structure where McCarty had been held, shots were fired. Hearn was hit in the stomach, a mortal wound. He would die from it. Baca, recognizing that he would not receive a fair hearing from this mob and would likely be lynched, fled across the plaza to another structure. This was the jacal belonging to Geronimo Armijo. It was small, perhaps 12 feet by 14 feet, built in the traditional style with walls of vertical mesquite sticks or posts set close together and the gaps filled with adobe mud, then plastered over. Part of the walls may have incorporated rough-cut lumber. The roof was flat, constructed of vigas, poles laid across the tops of the walls, covered with brush and earth. Critically, the floor was sunken, excavated 18 inches, or perhaps as much as 2 feet below the surrounding ground level. This was standard construction for thermal management in the high desert. The earth provided insulation. It also provided cover. When bullets came through the walls or gaps in the walls, they would tend to pass above a man lying on that depressed floor. Baca entered this structure and prepared to make his stand. The initial exchange of gunfire killed at least one more cowboy and may have wounded others. The exact sequence is unclear. What is documented is that by midday or early afternoon, a large number of armed men had surrounded the jacal. They were positioned behind cover around the plaza. in buildings, behind walls, in whatever defensive positions the terrain offered. They began firing on the structure. Baca, inside, returned fire through gaps in the walls, shooting at muzzle flashes or at any cowboy careless enough to expose himself. The volume of fire directed at the jackal was extraordinary. Witnesses described it as continuous for extended periods, then slackening, then resuming. The Cowboys were equipped with Winchester lever-action rifles, the standard tool of ranching and frontier life in 1884. A Winchester model. 1873, the most common rifle in the West at that time, held 15 cartridges in .44 caliber or .44-40. A practiced shooter could fire all 15 rounds in perhaps 20 to 30 seconds if he simply worked the lever and trigger without careful aim. Multiply that by 40 men, and you can deliver 600 rounds in under a minute. If 80 men participated at various times, you could sustain thousands of rounds over an extended period simply by rotating shooters. The numbers that would later be reported, 4,000 rounds fired at the jackal, sound implausible until you consider the mechanics. If 80 men each fired 50 rounds over the course of 33 hours, that totals 4,000 rounds. 50 rounds per man over a day and a half is entirely achievable, especially if ammunition resupply was available from the ranches or from sympathizers in the settlements. The Cowboys were not engaged in careful, aimed fire for the most part. They were saturating a target, hoping that sheer volume would eventually find the man inside. Bullets ripped through the mesquite and adobe walls. They splintered the wooden planks. They punched through the roof. 8 bullets would later be found embedded in the handle of a single broom that was inside the jackal. The door, when it was eventually removed and brought to court as evidence, was counted as having over 400 bullet holes. Some witnesses reported 367 distinct holes. Others said 400. The exact number mattered less than the visual impact. The door looked like a sieve. But Baca was not hit. The sunken floor saved him. When he lay prone on that earth, he was below the primary line of fire. Bullets that came through the walls at chest height passed over him. He could rise to shoot through gaps, then drop back to the floor. The structure was not fortified in any military sense. It was not designed as a defensive position. It simply happened to have one feature, the lowered floor, that gave its occupant a critical advantage. Baca also benefited from the randomness of bullet trajectories through irregular materials. Adobe and wood do not produce predictable bullet paths. Projectiles deflect, tumble, fragment. A bullet that enters at one angle may exit at another or may not exit at all, its energy absorbed by the dense mud. The sticks and poles of the wall, irregular in spacing and thickness, created a chaotic environment for incoming fire. But the chaos worked both ways. Baca could not see clearly to aim. He was shooting at sound and at glimpses through narrow gaps. Return fire was defensive, opportunistic. As night fell on the first day, the shooting did not stop. The Cowboys attempted various tactics. Some tried to rush the jackal, but Baca's return fire drove them back. According to later accounts, every time a group tried to close the distance, Baca shot at them and they retreated. The darkness made direct assault even riskier. The Cowboys could not see where Baca was inside the structure, could not coordinate timing for a simultaneous rush that might overwhelm him. Instead, they maintained siege, firing periodically, waiting for dawn. Baca, inside, had no water except what might have been stored in the jackal. He had no resupply of ammunition except what he had carried or found. He had no communication with anyone outside except through gunfire. The temperature at night in the high desert of New Mexico in late autumn or early winter drops precipitously. Daytime temperatures might reach the 50s or low 60s Fahrenheit. At night, they could fall to near freezing or below. Baca had whatever clothing he wore and whatever warmth the earth floor retained from the day. The siege continued through the night and into the second day. At some point, the Cowboys obtained dynamite. Accounts describe them blowing up part of the structure, possibly collapsing part of the roof. Baca survived. They tried setting fire to the jacal. The adobe and earth construction did not burn well. The wooden elements could char and smoke but not sustain flame sufficient to drive him out. Throughout all of this, Baca continued returning fire. The casualty count among the attackers is disputed. Baca himself would claim for the rest of his life that he killed 4 men and wounded 8 during the siege. Other accounts, reviewing contemporary records more carefully, suggest that only 1 man died from Baca's gunfire during the siege itself, with the second fatality being the slaughter foreman killed when his horse collapsed on him in the earlier confrontation. Perhaps 1 man was wounded seriously, shot through the knee. The exact count mattered politically and legally, but does not change the fundamental dynamics of the confrontation. 1 man, outnumbered by a factor of dozens, held off a sustained assault for more than a day. By the second day, the situation had reached stalemate. The Cowboys could not dislodge Baca without unacceptable casualties from a frontal assault. Baca could not break out. His ammunition had to be running low. The Cowboys' ammunition was also depleting. They had fired thousands of rounds. Resupply from the ranches would take time. At some point during the second day or early on the third day, someone sought out Francisquito Naranjo, who held a legitimate deputy sheriff commission for Socorro County. Naranjo arrived at the plaza and negotiated Baca's surrender. The terms were critical. Baca would surrender only to Naranjo, not to the Cowboys. He would surrender only on the condition that he be taken to Socorro for trial, not held locally where a lynch mob could seize him, and he would surrender with his pistols still in his hands and his badge still on his chest. Naranjo agreed. Baca emerged from the jacal. Accounts describe him cooking breakfast, making tortillas and coffee, before walking out. When he appeared, the bullet-riddled structure behind him, he was unhurt, not a scratch. After approximately 33 to 36 hours, with somewhere between 1,000 and 4,000 rounds fired at him, Elfego Baca walked away unscathed. The mythology obscures the mechanics, but the mechanics matter. Baca survived because of the sunken floor, because of the chaotic ballistics of bullets through adobe and wood, because the Cowboys, despite their numbers, could not coordinate effective small unit tactics to close and overwhelm him, and because a teenager with limited ammunition exercised enough fire discipline to make each shot defensive rather than exhausting his supply in wild return fire. He also survived because the Cowboys were not professionals in siege warfare. They were ranch hands, accustomed to working cattle, to occasional gunplay in saloons or personal disputes, but not to sustained tactical assault on a fortified or semi-fortified position. They had numbers and firepower, but not training or command structure beyond their ranch hierarchy. Baca had desperation, a defensible position, and enough skill with firearms to make rushing him too costly. The aftermath was legal and political. Baca was taken to Socorro and jailed. In May of 1885, 7 months after the siege, he was indicted for the murder of the slaughter foreman and Bert Hearn. The trial occurred in August 1885. The defense presented the bullet-riddled door as evidence. The jury saw a door with more than 400 holes, testimony to the sustained attack Baca had endured. They saw a young man who had been outnumbered at least 40 to 1, possibly 80 to 1, and who had defended himself from what any reasonable person could interpret as a lynch mob. The jury acquitted him. Baca's defense attorney reportedly produced documentation of Baca's deputization, though later biographical accounts suggest this documentation may have been fabricated or irregular, supporting the theory that Baca had self-appointed initially. The legal system in this instance sided with the Hispanic defendant against the Texas cattlemen, a verdict that reflected both the evidence and perhaps the jury composition and the political currents in Socorro County at that moment. Baca's acquittal elevated him immediately within the Hispanic community of New Mexico territory. He had stood against the Texans and survived. He had faced down a force that should have killed him 10 times over. He became a symbol of resistance against Anglo encroachment and lawlessness. Within the Anglo community, Reactions were mixed. Some saw him as a dangerous killer who had escaped justice. Others recognized him as a man who had defended himself against a mob. His reputation, regardless of how various factions interpreted it, was established. Elfego Baca was no longer an unknown 19-year-old. He was the man who held off 80 cowboys for 33 hours. The broader forces that produced the Frisco siege did not end with Baca's acquittal. The tension between Hispanic and Anglo populations in New Mexico territory was structural, rooted in economics and demographics and the long history of Spanish and Mexican colonization preceding American annexation in 1848. The cattle industry continued to expand through the 1880s, bringing more Texas ranchers and cowboys into territories that had been Hispanic for generations. Conflicts over land use, grazing rights, law enforcement, and cultural dominance played out in courtrooms, in elections, in vigilante actions, and occasionally in gunfire. Baca's case was not unique. It was exceptional in scale and duration, but not in the underlying dynamics. What followed for Baca was a long career in law enforcement, politics, and law. He officially became sheriff of Socorro County, though the exact timeline of his appointments and elections is somewhat murky in the historical record. He sent letters to wanted men informing them he had warrants for their arrest and suggesting they turn themselves in by a specified date, or he would come after them and feel justified in shooting them on sight. Most reportedly surrendered voluntarily rather than test whether Baca was bluffing. His reputation from the Frisco standoff served as a deterrent. In 1888, he became a deputy U.S. Marshal, serving for 2 years. He then studied law. In December 1894, he was admitted to the New Mexico bar. He practiced law in various locations, including El Paso and Albuquerque. He served as a county clerk, mayor of Socorro, school superintendent, and district attorney for Socorro and Sierra counties. His legal career was flamboyant. He told the Albuquerque Tribune on his 75th birthday that as a lawyer, he had defended 30 people charged with murder, and only one went to the penitentiary. Biographers noted he drank too much, talked too much, had a weakness for wild women, was often arrogant, and showed no compunction about killing people. He told an interviewer in 1936 that he never wanted to kill anybody, but if a man had it in his mind to kill him, he made it his business to get him first. In the early 20th century, Baca became involved in the Mexican Revolution. From 1913 to 1916, he served as the official representative in the United States of General Victoriano Huerta's government. The details of these activities are murky, but suggest Baca moved in circles far beyond small-town New Mexico law enforcement. One legend claims he stole a pistol from Pancho Villa and that Villa placed a $30,000 bounty on his head. Whether true or not, the story reflects the mythic status Baca acquired. He was a man about whom stories were told, some true, some embellished, some outright fiction. In July 1936, several years before his death, an interviewer from the WPA Federal Writers Project recorded Baca's recollections. Those notes are preserved in the Library of Congress and remain one of the primary sources for his version of events. Baca died on August 27, 1945, in Albuquerque. He was 80 years old. He had lived through the end of the Civil War, the Apache campaigns, the transformation of the West by railroads and barbed wire, and the cattle industry, 2 world wars, and the dawn of the atomic age. He died as an old man in a modern city, but his fame rested on 33 hours in a dirt-floor jacal when he was 19. The legend of Elfego Baca was revived in the late 1950s when Walt Disney Studios produced a 10-part television series called The 9 Lives of Elfego Baca, starring Robert Loggia. The series aired between October 1958 and March 1960 as part of Walt Disney Presents. Disney carefully researched the Frisco shootout and attempted to portray it with reasonable accuracy given the constraints of television production and the desire to create a heroic narrative palatable to a national audience. The series presented Baca as a Hispanic hero, the first such figure in American popular culture according to some historians. though Disney minimized ethnic tensions and portrayed Baca as a generalized Western lawman. Episodes were later edited into a feature film released in 1962 titled Elfego Baca, Six Gun Law. The series' theme song included the line, "And the legend was that, like El Gato the cat, 9 lives had Elfego Baca." The Disney treatment cemented Baca in American cultural memory, at least for the generation that watched television in the late 1950s and early 1960s. But the Disney version was sanitized, heroic, and simplified. The real story was messier, more violent, more ambiguous. The myth of the Frisco shootout tends to emphasize Baca's skill and bravery, which were certainly present, but the myth often omits the structural context. This was not a fair fight, or a gunfight in the Hollywood sense of 2 men facing off at noon on an empty street. This was a siege, a disproportionate application of force by one side against a cornered target, and the target's survival was as much a function of terrain and construction and the attacker's limitations as it was Baca's marksmanship. The myth also tends to simplify the ethnic dimension. Baca was not fighting for some abstract principle of law and order. He was asserting the right of Hispanic residents to equal treatment under territorial law and resisting a power structure that privileged Anglo cattlemen. His stand resonated because it challenged that hierarchy. But myths cannot capture complexity. They reduce events to symbols, heroes and villains, good and evil. The historical reality is that Baca shot and killed multiple men, that those men likely believed they were pursuing a murderer who had killed their foreman and Bert Hearn, that violence on all sides was commonplace in the territory in 1884, and that the legal system sometimes worked and sometimes failed, depending on who had power in a particular county at a particular moment. Socorro County, in the years following the shootout, continued to evolve. The cattle industry reached its peak and then contracted. Overgrazing degraded rangeland. Droughts periodically devastated herds. The open range was gradually enclosed by barbed wire as ranchers secured title to land or leased it formally. The Mexican Revolution sent refugees and political intrigue spilling across the border. World War I reshaped economies. The automobile and truck replaced horses and cattle drives. Magdalena remained a railhead until the line was abandoned in the late bull. 20th century. The San Francisco River Valley, site of the Frisco settlements, remained remote and sparsely populated. Reserve, the former Upper San Francisco Plaza, became the seat of Catron County when it was carved out of Socorro County in 1921. By the 21st century, Reserve's population was under 300. The Frisco settlements faded almost to ghost towns. Middle Frisco had a population of 77 as of the 2010 census. Lower Frisco was even smaller. The Jackal, where Baca made his stand, did not survive. Adobe structures deteriorate rapidly without maintenance. The wood rots, the mud erodes, the roof collapses. By the mid-20th century, no trace remained. The exact site is known only approximately. In 2008, the Elfego Baca Foundation opened a small memorial in Reserve. Visitors can see a replica jackal constructed to approximate the original. It sits in a plaza with interpretive signs. The bullet-riddled door, the key piece of physical evidence from the trial, has been lost. No photograph of it is known to exist. We know it had more than 400 holes because multiple witnesses testified to that fact, but we cannot see it. The broom handle with 8 bullets embedded in it, also described in contemporary accounts, has likewise vanished. The material evidence of the siege has disappeared, leaving only the documentary record, trial transcripts, newspaper accounts, later interviews, and the accumulated legend. The question of casualties remains unresolved. Baca claimed 4 killed, 8 wounded. His defenders and biographers repeated those numbers for decades. But careful review of contemporary sources, particularly accounts from participants on the Cowboys side, suggests the actual toll was lower. One man certainly died from gunfire during the siege itself. A second, the slaughter foreman, died when his horse fell on him, which may or may not count as killed by Baca, depending on interpretation. One man was shot through the knee, a serious wound but not fatal. The inflated numbers served Baca's legend, but may not reflect reality. Conversely, the Cowboys had every incentive to minimize their casualties and may have concealed deaths or treated wounded men at ranches without reporting injuries. The fog of history obscures the truth. What is certain is that men died and men were wounded, that Baca survived, and that the disproportion of force was extreme. Modern analysis of the event tends to focus on several themes. First, the ethnic dimension and the power dynamics of territorial New Mexico. Baca's stand was not just personal survival, it was a statement about whose law prevailed and whether Hispanic residents would submit to violence from Anglo newcomers. Second, the mechanics of frontier violence and the reality of gunfights as opposed to their Hollywood portrayal. The Frisco siege was chaotic, prolonged, marked by poor marksmanship and amateur tactics, not the quick draw, duels of cinema. Third, the role of physical environment and architecture in determining outcomes. The sunken floor saved Baca's life. Without that feature, he would almost certainly have been killed in the first hours. Fourth, the mythology of the West, and how figures like Baca were constructed into legends that served political and cultural purposes. Disney's Baca was a hero for a 1950s television audience seeking morally clear narratives. The real Baca was a more complicated figure, violent, politically engaged, ethnically conscious, legally astute later in life, and willing to use his reputation to intimidate. The immediate consequences of the Frisco siege were legal and reputational. Baca was acquitted, his career launched. The slaughter ranch and other Texas operations continued working cattle in Socorro County, but the message had been sent. Hispanic communities would resist. Law enforcement, at least in this instance, would back them. The longer-term consequences are harder to trace. Did the siege alter power dynamics in the region? Marginally, perhaps. Did it reduce violence against Hispanic residents? There's no evidence of significant change. Did it contribute to Baca's later political success? Certainly. His reputation as the man who held off 80 cowboys carried him through elections and appointments for decades. But the larger patterns of territorial development, the influx of Anglo settlers, the dispossession of Hispanic land grants through legal and illegal means, the gradual Americanization of New Mexico, all proceeded regardless of one siege in one remote valley. Baca's stand was a moment of resistance, dramatic and inspiring to those who saw him as a hero, but it did not stop the structural changes transforming New Mexico territory into New Mexico State, admitted to the Union in 1912, 28 years after the Frisco shootout. Environmental and economic factors also shaped the aftermath. The high desert rangeland of western New Mexico could not sustain unlimited cattle. Overgrazing led to erosion, decline in forage quality, and reduced carrying capacity. Ranchers who arrived in the 1880s expecting endless grass found that the land degraded under heavy use. The boom contracted into a more sustainable equilibrium, but only after ecological damage that persists. The railroad that made cattle shipping economical also brought homesteaders, farmers, and miners, increasing competition for land and water. The federal government began regulating grazing on public lands, establishing the Forest Service in 1905, eventually creating a permitting system that replaced the open range. The economic model that brought John Bunyan Slaughter and his cowboys to Socorro County changed fundamentally within a generation. By the 1920s and 30s, large cattle operations in New Mexico were corporate or family dynasties operating under federal regulation, not Texas cowboys claiming open range. The Apache presence, which had defined the region's violence for much of the 19th century, was effectively ended by the mid-1880s through military campaigns and forced relocation to reservations. This opened the country to settlement, but also removed a shared threat that had sometimes unified Hispanic and Anglo residents against a common enemy. With the Apache threat removed, internal conflicts between Hispanic and Anglo populations became more prominent. The Frisco siege occurred at this transitional moment after the Apache Wars, but before the full consolidation of Anglo economic and political dominance. Baca's defiance represented a form of resistance that would become increasingly difficult as Anglo control of legal, economic, and political institutions solidified through the territorial period and into statehood. Baca's later career as a lawyer and politician allowed him to navigate this changing landscape. He learned English fluently, though he was fully bilingual. He practiced Anglo-American law while maintaining strong ties to Hispanic communities. He served in positions that required negotiation between ethnic constituencies. His ability to operate in both worlds, to be both the hero of Frisco and a respectable lawyer in Albuquerque, reflected the hybrid nature of New Mexico itself, a place where Spanish and Mexican heritage remained strong even as American institutions and Anglo settlers became dominant. Baca died before the full civil rights movement of the mid-20th century, but his life and legend prefigured later Chicano activism that would reclaim Hispanic history and assert civil rights in the Southwest. The technical details of the siege offer lessons in both firearms and fortifications. The Winchester rifles used by the Cowboys fired cartridges with relatively low muzzle velocity compared to modern centerfire rifles. A 44-40 cartridge, the most common Winchester load in 1884, propelled a 200-grain bullet at approximately 1,300 feet per second. This is far slower than modern rifle cartridges. Lower velocity means less penetration through obstacles. Adobe, being dense earth, absorbs kinetic energy efficiently. Wood, even thin planks, can deflect or slow bullets significantly. The combination of adobe and wood in the jackal's walls created a barrier that was imperfect. Bullets did pass through, but not as easily as through lighter construction. Modern military experience shows that adobe structures provide substantial protection against small arms fire, more than many people assume. Baca benefited from this without necessarily understanding the physics. The sustained volume of fire also created its own problems for the attackers. Smoke from black powder cartridges, still in use in 1884 alongside the newer smokeless powder, would have obscured vision. Noise would have been overwhelming. Coordination among 80 men spread around a plaza, shooting at varying intervals, with no radio communication and limited command structure, would have been nearly impossible. The chaos benefited the defender. Baca only had to watch gaps in his walls and shoot at targets that presented themselves. The attackers had to avoid hitting each other, maintain fire discipline, and coordinate any assault, all without modern communications. The sunken floor, already discussed, cannot be overstated. A drop of 18 to 24 inches places a prone man below the likely aim point of someone shooting from outside at what they assume is floor level. Human nature is to aim at center mass of where you think the target is. If you think the floor is at ground level and you're aiming chest high, you're aiming 2 or 3 feet above the actual floor. Your bullet passes over the man lying on that floor. This is not sophisticated tactics, it's accidental geometry. But geometry often determines survival in combat environments. The difference between life and death can be inches or a single layer of material. For Baca, the difference was a floor dug below grade. The question of Baca's ammunition supply remains unanswered in the historical record. He entered the jacal with whatever he carried in gun belts and pockets, perhaps 50 to 100 rounds total for 2 pistols and a rifle if he had all 3. Maybe more if he carried extra boxes of cartridges. Maybe less. There may have been additional ammunition stored in the jacal by its owner. During 33 hours of siege, Baca could not have fired continuously or even frequently without exhausting his supply. His return fire had to be selective, defensive, shooting only when targets presented clearly or when he needed to deter a rush. This discipline, maintaining fire control under extreme stress, is difficult. It requires awareness of ammunition count, which is nearly impossible to track during sustained action, and requires accepting long periods of incoming fire without returning it to conserve rounds. If Baca maintained this discipline, and his survival suggests he did, it speaks to either training, instinct, or luck. Probably all three. After the siege ended and Baca was taken to Socorro for trial, the political maneuvering began. The slaughter ranch and allied interests wanted him convicted. The Hispanic community wanted him freed. The territorial legal system, such as it was, had to navigate these pressures. The fact that Baca was acquitted in a jurisdiction where Anglos held significant power suggests either that the evidence genuinely supported self-defense, that the jury was more Hispanic than typical for territorial trials, or that political calculations favored acquittal to avoid further violence. Trial records, if they survive complete, would clarify jury composition and deliberation length. The introduction of the bullet-riddled door as evidence was theatrical, but effective. Physical evidence that dramatic would have been impossible for jurors to ignore. The broader significance of the Elfego Baca story in American Western history is complex. He does not appear in standard narratives of frontier lawmen like Wyatt Earp, Pat Garrett, or Wild Bill Hickok. He is not mentioned in most general histories of the West. He is largely a regional figure remembered in New Mexico and to some extent in Hispanic communities across the Southwest, but not nationally recognized despite the Disney series. This obscurity is partly historical accident, partly the result of ethnic hierarchies in historical memory. The figures who became nationally famous tended to be Anglo, operating in territories or events that captured Eastern journalists' attention. The gunfight at the OK Corral became famous partly because Tombstone was a major mining town with national press coverage. Frisco was an obscure settlement in one of the most remote counties in New Mexico territory. No New York newspaper sent a correspondent. No dime novels were written immediately after. The story remained local until Disney rediscovered it 70 years later. Baca's own personality contributed to his legend and his legacy. He was garrulous, boastful, politically connected, and lived long enough to tell his own story repeatedly. The 1936 WPA interview captured his voice, his version, which subsequent biographers relied on despite its obvious self-serving elements. Baca had 8 decades to refine his narrative, to emphasize drama and heroism, to claim 4 killed and 8 wounded, even if the real numbers were lower. He became, in a sense, his own myth-maker. This is common among frontier figures who lived into the 20th century. They shaped their legacies through interviews, memoirs, and public appearances. Baca did this skillfully, maintaining his reputation until his death and ensuring his story would be preserved, even if imperfectly. The Frisco siege also illustrates the limitations of violence as a tool for social change. Baca's stand gained him personal fame and, arguably, improved his community's immediate security, but it did not fundamentally alter power structures. The cattle ranches continued operating. Anglo settlement continued expanding. Hispanic land tenure continued eroding through legal manipulations and economic pressure. One man's heroic defense could not counter systemic forces. What it could do, and did do, was provide a symbol, a story, a moment when resistance succeeded, and that symbolic value mattered. Communities under pressure need heroes. They need evidence that resistance is possible. Baca provided that, and the story was told and retold, shaping collective memory and identity. In the end, what happened in the Jackal during those 33 hours in late 1884 was both less and more than legend suggests. It was less in the sense that Baca's survival owed as much to the sunken floor and the attacker's tactical limitations as to his skill. The casualty count was probably lower than claimed. The dramatic elements, dynamite and fire, and thousands of rounds, were real but also chaotic and less cinematically precise than later retellings suggest. But it was more in the sense that the siege represented genuine courage under impossible odds, real resistance against ethnic oppression, and a moment when law, however imperfectly applied, sided with the Hispanic community against Anglo aggression. That meant something. It changed Baca's life. It changed how that community saw itself. It left a mark on territorial history that, while not transformative in structural terms, was significant in human terms. Elfego Baca lived another 61 years after the Frisco siege. He argued cases, held offices, engaged in political intrigue in the Mexican Revolution, defended murderers, drank heavily, died old and relatively prosperous in Albuquerque in 1945. But he never experienced anything comparable to those 33 hours when he was 19 years old, lying on a dirt floor while bullets tore through the walls above him, not knowing if the next round would be the one that found him. Every long life has its defining moment. For Baca, this was it. Everything after was epilogue.